call this meeting to order of the Oversight Committee for the date of October the 2nd. And may I have a roll call, please?
Board members Apkarian.
Here.
Berry. Nakasone.
Here.
Ochoa.
Here.
Sheehan.
Here.
Steger.
Present.
Chair Raggio.
Yes, here. Next item, please.
The report of the Secretary, the agenda for the October 2, 2013 regular meeting of the Glendale Oversight Board was posted on Thursday, September 26, 2013 on the bulletin board outside City Hall, and at 2A is approval of minutes.
Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, but I do have a comment.
All right.
Just out of curiosity, I know Mr. Ochoa came in after we had started and he's marked absent. And then I noticed he's down. He's down for a move on the second item. So
Yeah,
I don't know if we
actually,
designate someone came in.
Chair Raggio and the board members, initially he was absent. That's why I note further down, if you look right below item 4B, after I have listed Elena Bobolian presenting, I indicated that he entered the chamber at 2:43.
I think that makes me tardy, sir.
Yes, it does.
Or absent up until. I didn't have a second. Is there a second on
Second.
that? And roll call.
Board members Apkarian.
Yes.
Berry. Nakasone.
Yes.
Ochoa.
Just reflecting the tardiness. Yes.
Sheehan.
Yes.
Steger.
Yes.
Chair Raggio.
Yes. Next item, please.
Okay, there are no informational items on the agenda. At 4A is Director of Economic Development regarding Long Range Property Management Plan, LRPMP, and at 4A1 is Resolution approving the LRPMP.
Good afternoon, board members. We have for your consideration today the Long Range Property Management Plan. Up to this point, you have been overseeing the cash of the former redevelopment agency, and today's action item is one of the last hurdles in this dissolution process, and it deals with the real property assets of the former redevelopment agency. In Glendale, we have 10 properties, and the law allows 4 categories to deal with each of the properties. You can either retain the property to fulfill an enforceable obligation. You can designate it as government use, and there's a list of categories in the law. You can either sell it, and the last choice is to retain it for future development. In Glendale, of the 10 properties, we have 6 that we have designated to keep to fulfill an enforceable obligation, 3 that we are designating as government use, and 1 property to be sold. The 11th one is some arcade machines that belong to a building that we owned, and so we also are proposing to sell those, but we're not counting it as a property since it's just equipment. I can, if the board would like, I can go through each property, or I can take questions on whatever properties you have. What's the pleasure of the board?
I think it might be worthwhile to just shortly go through the properties that are in question, because there are 3 categories, and to identify the distinctions between the categories.
Okay. So we put together a short PowerPoint, and it mirrors the narrative report that you received. And so the first group that we're going to tackle is the 6 properties that we are designating to keep to fulfill an enforceable obligation. So the first one is the Alex Theater. As you know, through the ROPS process, we have a lease and a management agreement with Glendale Arts, the operator of the Alex Theater. They both expire June of 2015, and the reason that date was chosen was back in 2008 when the documents were executed. This is prior to dissolution. the agency's wish was for the Alex Theater to be self-sufficient at the same time as the central Glendale project area was set to sunset. And that sunset date is, I believe, August 2015. So the agency acquired this property back in 1992, and the operator is a nonprofit, Glendale Art. This is a performing arts theater. It's 21,000 square feet, and again, our enforceable obligations to the operator are to provide a management fee for the next 2 years until that agreement expires, and there are a list of capital improvement projects that the agency is required to fund as the landlord, and those you've approved through the ROPS process. Are there any questions on the Alex Theater?
I have a question, and that probably once you answer this, it probably is going to be a running answer to the rest. Why does it say estimated current value 0, estimated current parcel value 0?
On the Alex Theater, we estimated the value of 0 because the theater operates at a loss right now. Anybody that were to purchase this would have to put in the capital improvements that are required, as well as the management fee. So with it being underwater, we concluded that it didn't have any value.
So you're saying that Alex Theater property on Brand Boulevard has no value as of today?
With those conditions, yes. It doesn't generate any positive cash flow.
Let's say if the management company goes bankrupt tomorrow, could we sell that property for a value? That's what I'm saying. I mean, how can you? It boggles my mind to say that the Alex Theater on Brand Boulevard, one of the most expensive real estate in Glendale, has no value because of the management.
It is zoned for...
Parcel, I can understand the estimated current value being 0, but the estimated current parcel value can't be 0.
Again, given market conditions, given the conditions of a sale, which would be to operate the theater as a regional performing arts center, we don't believe it has a value. If it does have a value and it were to be ordered to be sold, it would be sold for that value. This is our estimate, though. Given those conditions of negative cash flow, the zoning that's in place on it to really limit it to a regional performing arts center, and the capital requirements of ownership.
In other words, it can't be used for anything else.
Can't use it for a church or other types of nightclub. That's very limited into the types of uses that you could put in it. And then with those conditions on top of it, we estimated, and that's why we put market, that it's 0. We did not do an appraisal on it.
Okay, and just a question out of ignorance, not knowing the zoning and that, but even having said that, if someone were to buy the property, could they tear it down and put a restaurant? Because I know there are other restaurants in that area.
A whole bunch of answers to that. It is historically significant on our local register and on the national register as a performing arts center. If you did do an environmental impact report to tear it down, the underlying zoning is still civic use, and you would be limited in the types of uses that you could put that property to.
But going back to your original statement, because it has historical value, that in some ways would support the 0 value.
It's a historic structure, and so there are further limitations on what you can and can't do with it. So yes, that would affect value.
But to the hypothetical Mr. Abkarian posed, if we didn't have any kind of obligation to improve the property whatsoever?
If you didn't have any obligation to improve the property that goes along with the current, there are some uses, I suppose, that you could put the property to some use that would generate some income. It would be very limited in what you could generate. So for somebody that wanted to run a performing arts theater, assuming they could generate a positive cash flow, there may be some value to it.
A case in point, we have an agreement with Glendale Arts. They are an ongoing concern as far as we can tell, so we still have those obligations as reflected in the
That is
lease.
correct.
Okay. I guess I'll ask some more questions when we get to the other zeros because they're not as significant as Alex Theater is. So we can, when we get, I mean, I don't know if you want to tackle those now or we want to go through them one by one. When you get to each one, then I can ask a question, I guess, at that point.
When we get to each one. Is that all that, the questions with the Alex? We'll take the next one.
Second property is at 212 and 216 South Brand. This is a property that the agency purchased to make way for the Museum of Neon Art project. We have a ground lease agreement with Mona. Property was, a piece of it was purchased in 2002 and also in 2010. It's 10,000 square feet, and we have estimated the current value at $750,000. We have enforceable obligations as the landlord of the property. We have to, we have some tenant improvements and structural work that we have to do as the landlord. Then we turn it over to Mona to operate as a museum. So those are the highlights. Are there any specific questions on this property?
Questions? Next item.
The next property is the corner of Central and Wilson Avenue, 225 West Wilson. A parking lot, public parking lot, and we want to keep it to fulfill an enforceable obligation. The obligation being our conveyance of the site to a developer to build a Courtyard Marriott Hotel, purchased back in 1986. Current value is a little bit over $1 million. There was an appraisal done in 2013, and that came in at $3.3 million. It's 18,720 square feet, and the income from when it was operating as a parking lot was $16,000, excluding the maintenance costs. Are there any questions on this property?
Questions? We'll go to the next one then.
Okay. The next is at 111 East Wilson Avenue. There's a current Panda Inn restaurant at this site, and this site was purchased by the agency in 1982. The enforceable obligation is to, along with some adjacent properties, to make way for a mixed-use project. The current value is a little bit over $1 million, and that was derived on a market basis as opposed to an appraisal. 4,300 square feet, and let's see. The agency does receive some lease revenue from the Panda Inn operator. Those are the highlights on this property. Are there any questions?
Questions? Americana.
Okay. Moving along to the Americana parking structure. When the Americana project was being negotiated, there was the ground lease related to the parking, and there's this parking agreement is tied to other agreements related to the development, and so we'd like to keep it to fulfill the enforceable obligation. value at the time of purchase was $18 million. We don't have a current value. And if you refer to the memo that was received from the county, one of the questions was the income that comes in from this parking structure, and so we put some information together that I will go over very briefly. So the center opened in May of 2008, and so for the last 5 years, the net revenues to the agency have fluctuated from from a low of 0 to a high of $217,000. And so there are years when it didn't make any money after you took in the cost to maintain it, and the highest was this last year, 2012, where our contribution was $217,000. And so going forward, we would like to apply this revenue to fulfill future enforceable obligations rather than request from the RPTTF fund.
Questions?
So the revenue is generated from place. That's why you put the value of the property at 0, even though it generates $200,000 last year?
That's correct. It's a 95-year lease at $1 a year, so it's virtually a sale of the underlying fee, and it's only the underlying fee. We could not calculate, we would not know, nor would a buyer know, what that revenue might be. Again, it's gone from a losing money to last year was a high of 217. It could fluctuate if the developer decided to pull and have free parking, then it would be 0 every year. So again, we didn't know. The fallback position, though, is whatever revenue is generated from that comes into the successor agency account. When we do our ROPS, you'll note on our ROPS we have other, and the law prescribes that we use other revenues first before we ask for new property tax. So in a sense, any revenue that comes in offsets the request for more property tax, leaving that much more for the taxing agencies. So you do mechanically get a distribution of those funds to each of the property taxing entities.
And as this goes on for 95 years, at some point, when all of our obligations are paid, whatever comes in will come back to you again and distributed to your taxing entities.
So I have a question. Has the Department of Finance put out some guidelines on how to come up with the estimated value, current value, or is that just left up to the successor agencies to do?
They really haven't. It's left up to the successor agency. And I guess the fact that there is an enforceable obligation on it, we're required to enforce this lease going forward, or we're required to lease to the Museum of Neon Art, or we're required to sell to a body based on a figure in an agreement. The Department of Finance wasn't as concerned with that number when we're putting forth an enforceable obligation. The real key is for properties that you're selling, get an idea of what might come back to the taxing entities. We don't have any of those, save those two we talked about.
And if there was, you'd be doing an appraisal and a hard number.
We could do an appraisal on them, but at the end of the day, it's going to be whatever the property sells for.
Right.
We don't, at least I should say, Mr. Stiga, I don't know if we have the choice of not selling a property at something less than fair market value, because the law says you will dispose of it.
That's interesting. Works both sides.
So if somebody wants to come and buy it and pay the $18 million and take over the revenue, they can do that.
Well, they could take over the ground lease, the underlying fee, for 95 years in the hopes that there's some revenue. If you were to decide that this isn't an enforceable obligation and should be sold.
Further questions? Next item, please.
Okay, item number 6, and there's a correction on the estimated current value. We printed up a replacement sheet, which should be on your desks. It's page 17, and so this shows the revised amount of $1.2 million as opposed to the 1.925 noted in your brochure. So if you could swap those pages out. And this was based on an appraisal, and so we apologize for the wrong figure making it into the narrative report and your chart. We will make sure it's revised in the official version. So this is a parking lot, and it was purchased back in 1988. Our enforceable obligation is for us to convey the site to Conrad's Restaurant. The current value, again, based on an appraisal, is $1.2 million. And this is one of the properties that the Conrad's owner continuously asks the agency, what's the status, what's the status. They're eager for us to convey this to them. And we have told them that we need to wrap this into our long-range property management plan, and we may be bringing an item to you to convey this site at a future meeting. But this is one that's I don't want to say is more urgent, but definitely the owner of the property would like us to convey this to them so they can move forward with their plans. There is some lease revenue that comes into the agency. It's about $44,000, and the size is about 14,200 square feet. Are there any questions on this property?
Questions?
Just that it would be sold to the highest bidder, even if it's not Conrad's.
No, there is an enforceable obligation to sell this to Conrad's. In the agreement that was 2005, I think, was the amendment.
And then the 1.9, where did that come from? Was it a previous estimate, or?
It was a typo, and we were looking at, we had information on several sheets, and we just put it in the wrong.
Okay, so there was never a $1.9 million appraisal on the property ever?
Okay,
Any more questions?
So that concludes all of the properties that we'd like to retain to fulfill enforceable obligations. The next category is properties to be used for government use. The first one is the Americana open space parcel, which we also refer to as the park at the Americana. This parcel was purchased by the agency as part of the larger development of the Americana. So sometime over the last 30 years, when all of the properties were being purchased by the agency. Value at the time of purchase was $13.4 million. Again, it's got a zero current value, because it does have to be used as a park or an open space per the agreements with the developer. Size-wise, it's 130,000 square feet, and that's all I have on that property, unless there are any questions.
Questions? Next item, please.
The next item is the Paseo roadway walkway. This is at 218 through 222 South Brand. And the picture in your packet and up on the screen shows current construction that's happening to make way for this future Paseo. This site abuts the Mona project site, and per the building code, the Mona's project has to open up onto public right-of-way, and so we have designated this as government use with the understanding that it'd be used as a roadway/walkway. It was purchased back in 2002, and at the time it was $1.4 million again, zero current value, and it's 6,250 square feet.
Questions? Next item, please.
Okay. Next one is a public parking lot at 300 East Broadway. It was purchased back in 2001 for $525,000. Current value is noted as zero. $7,500 square feet. It's a 50 by 150 lot size. It generates approximately $1,000 per month, according to our parking manager. And so we'd like to designate this as government use as a parking lot.
Now, I have a question on that again. Why is that estimate current value at zero?
As a parking lot, it doesn't return, costs outweigh revenue as a parking lot. We looked at it as a development site. Once you take away for setbacks and other landscape requirements, and you figure the parking, given it's 7,500, actually, it would be 38 by 138. Really couldn't put any parking underneath. So your resulting building is somewhere between 1,400 and 2,900 square feet that you could build on that site as an office, which would have the lowest parking requirement. The return on that, after you figure costs, is somewhere between 4 and 4.5%.
Can't you ask for a variance on some other parking lot somewhere and try to go for a variance like a lot of other people in the area have done? You guys gave free parking in Maryland to another property, so why wouldn't you be able to go for a variance and at least have that? You can't be for zero on Broadway. I mean, this is just mind-boggling that you put $0 value for this property. Okay, anyway, I don't want to argue it. I just wanted to just get an idea.
Any further comment, Bill? Further questions? Being none, we'll go on to the possible use category.
This is the last category because we don't have any in that fourth category, which is to retain for future development. And so this is 117 North Maryland, and this is what we refer to as the exchange commercial retail space. This is the storefronts along Maryland Avenue. There's also a large parking lot with this development. It was purchased back in the 1980s. We attempted to look for the files. We were unable to find the purchase price at the time. Current value is estimated at almost $1.5 million, and a little over 9,000 square feet. This is one where we don't have an enforceable obligation. We can't designate it as government use, and so we are designating it for sale. We don't know how that's quite going to work with DOF, but at this point, that's our recommendation to you, is to put this property up for sale.
Can I ask one quick question then? Mm-hmm. Even if it has no parking of its own, it needs the parking in the exchange.
That's correct. It relies on the parking in the exchange per agreements that date to the late 80s.
It's a parking structure that we own and we get to hold on to because it's a public parking structure.
It is a public parking structure which was conveyed to the city back in 1992. There's a little bit of there's some paperwork error, but we talked to the Department of Finance, and they recognized that as a city parking lot. This, on the other hand, was supposed to be conveyed to a private developer. In fact, it was. It came back to the redevelopment agency as part of a bankruptcy settlement. All of the agreements tie together that these parcels, these retail units, rely on the public parking garage, which is owned by the city and intended to be owned by the city, for their parking. as does all of the other properties within the exchange.
As a matter of history, this was during the Platts-Howard event, wasn't it? Wasn't
Indeed,
that
it was.
The property that, yeah.
Yes, and it was a group of about 5 or 6 property owners that got together with the redevelopment agency to build the exchange, which is a collection of independently owned developments that all rely on this parking. This was a piece to, one, hide the parking lot from the pedestrian, create some interest, some pedestrian interest on the street.
So what happens to any issues with respect to these units if there's some kind of structural issue? I mean, they're integrated into that parking structure.
You know, I
it
think
just makes sense that we would hold on to it because you could have issues later on with a private property owner that is tied inextricably to public property.
Mr. Ochoa, I'm not certain, and I might have to defer to one of your colleagues there. I believe that parcel is independent and the structure is independent.
So there's no internal connection between them at all?
There's not. They share a wall in the back, and that's part of the downside of this property. There is no back entrance, there is no loading, everything goes in through the front. But I don't believe structurally they're tied together.
So if a gigantic mouse bored a hole through the back wall that they share with the structure, who's on the hook for that? It just seems to make sense that we
The
should be able to
captain was
hold on.
watching this.
I chaired the redevelopment agency during that year, and we didn't consider a giant mouse.
Always got to consider the giant mouse option. Just prudent planning.
You know, in fact, this property, for all intents and purposes, it is integrated, but it is a separate parcel. It was intended to be privately held, and so we could not find a legitimate reason to say the city should hang on to that for either enforceable obligation or government use.
And what is it a book value? Why is it not an appraised value where we would know what the value is actually, a current market value on it?
We did not do an appraisal on it. On this, I believe we looked at rents, and then we used a market rate cap for it. But again, on the sale of this property, the sale price is going to be the sale price. We don't even know yet how we're prescribed to sell it. That's something that the Department of Finance has not given direction on yet.
So at this point, the value is kind of immaterial because you're saying we basically have to sell it, whether it's
We'd have-
$1 or $1 million.
That's correct.
Wow.
This is an estimate, an idea of what we think the value is based on the rents that we've been able to generate. And I will say that this area has had difficulty keeping their occupancy up because the units are substandard. There really is no back door, there's no loading, and they're quite small. They're between 800 and 1,000 feet.
Further questions? Seeing none?
Okay, and the last piece are some arcade machines that were in the building at 216 South Brand, which the agency purchased back in 2009, again, to make way for the Mona project. And we currently have them stored in storage because we want to protect the assets. We couldn't just get rid of them. We had to deal with them through this dissolution process. And they were noted in our DDR, but they were not listed individually. And so although they don't really belong here, it's our way of getting the Department of Finance to give us some direction on how to deal with disposing of these. We do have some interest from the community.
Are we talking like Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Donkey Kong? What are we
I'll
talking about?
defer to Mark Berry as the project manager.
Really? Vintage? All right. Really?
That came from the arcade where Mona is going to be in, right? Huh? Right? The location where Mona is going to be now.
Correct.
There used to be an arcade there.
Mr. Chair, if I could go back to a property, something Mr. Abkarian said. I'm noting our value basis, you noted was book value. That's incorrect. It should say market. It's market value, what we did. We're not carrying the book value at $1.4 million in the successor agency's financial reporting.
And market value is something.
Market value is our estimate of what it is. So that, thank you for pointing that out. That's a correction we'll make as we send it to the Department of Finance.
Discussion with respect to the topic? Are we ready to take action on this? Then I'll entertain a motion.
I'll move the item.
Any further?
I'll second.
Any further discussion? A roll call, please.
Board members Edkarian,
No.
Barry,
Yes.
Nakasone,
Yes.
Ochoa,
Yes.
Sheehan,
Yes.
Steger,
Yes.
Chair Raggio.
Yes. Motion passes. Next item?
Item 5 is oral communications, and no cards were submitted.
All right.
And item 6 is board member staff comments.
Are there comments from the board members? Seeing none, we'll go on. We have no need for a closed session. Any new business? I entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Is there a second? Roll call?
Seconded?
There's a second.
I'll second.